Welcome to the SaaS Revolution Show. Marvin Fletcher Rogers, Solutions Consultant at Sage Intacct. Welcome, Marvin.
Thanks, Alex.
Good to have you here. We did a video on YouTube, I think a while back. So the second time speaking with you, first time on the podcast, which is great. And I know I'm speaking to you on a sweltering hot day in the UK. And unfortunately, as you've got your windows closed because of some works outside. But yeah, hopefully I'll take it easy on you so that the questions, we're not going to make you sweat any more than you have to. The weather's making you.
I appreciate that. And as you mentioned, yeah, long-time listener, second-time caller. So yeah, looking forward to it.
Good stuff. Well, great to have you on the podcast. As it's the first time on the podcast, Marvin, why don't you tell the listeners a little bit about yourself? Who's Marvin Fletcher Rogers as a human, and then what are you doing at Sage?
Awesome. Yeah, sure. So thanks, Alex. So my name is Marvin Fletcher Rogers, as Alex mentioned. I'm a solution consultant at Sage, which focusing on the Sage Intacct product, which is the sort of cloud-native finance management system that's aimed at mid-market organizations. In terms of my background, so I've been working largely with cloud applications from ERP to CRM to support to project management, financial planning, and really the staple within that is working within the confines of software and technology and services based organizations. So within Sage, I work within the software and tech vertical, which means I tend to engage with high growth or even hyper growth subscription based organizations that have usually outgrown a system of sorts and are looking for that sort of scalable solution to take them into the next level and beyond. I'd say outside of work, I'm a massive sports fan. So as I mentioned earlier, I've got my first pre-season session in this sweltering heat later on. So that's a bit of me.
Pre-season in what, Marvin?
In rugby. Sorry, should have hastened to mention. Yeah, rugby for my sins.
And what's your team?
I play for Old Wolverhamptons, which is an old boys team for my school, and I play in the backs.
Very cool, very good. So expecting some tries to be scored.
We hope.
Good stuff. Well, Marvin. So obviously, a big part of the reason we're doing this podcast is that SaaStock together with Sage Intacct, we put together an ebook for SaaS Finance Leaders, which is called Scaling Up, 5 Key Things SaaS Finance Leaders Need to Know. And it's out now. So excited. We've been working on that, I think, for several months together. I think it's one of the first sort of ebooks that we're publishing sort of this year, and full of some great gold dust and sort of like nuggets for SaaS finance leaders, in particular. So today, we don't want to give it away, and we don't want to give people an opportunity not to read the ebook, but we want to go into some of the points and value here that we can share with the listeners. That we've got a lot of founders that listen to the podcast, but those that SaaS finance leaders as well. Those founders can share with their finance leaders, and I think it would make for a super interesting sort of conversation. So we want to go into these top 5 priorities of growth-focused SaaS finance leaders, and get you to kind of give us a couple of nuggets on each of those top 5 priorities. So I guess kind of first of all, let's go into the first one. So scaling up, what you need to prove at each growth stage. So take us from there in terms of what are the things that you need to prove.
Yeah, sure. And just before I get into that, I think broadly speaking, some of the themes of the book and certainly what it references is this shift in mindset from being operational to being strategic. So this is sort of one of the sort of key steps in that, and it's very much geared for finance leaders within pretty much everything across that whole spectrum, from startup to scale up, right, and then from scale up right through to exit. And the idea is to talk about the various different ways to prove what is success within those various different stages. So if we take an example, and we start right at the beginning, if we think of the early stage organizations, so typically VC backed, just past startup, so you've identified that you've got a product and a market fit, but it's now about proving the revenue model itself. So the book sort of references some of the key metrics that you would typically use within that early stage process to capture what that revenue model success looks like. So things like growth rate, things like ensuring the sales team have some consistency in the targets they hit. From a finance perspective, it's very much around cash. So it goes into a bit more detail around sort of how finance focus within the remit of cash at that point, to try and effectively just keep the lights on, and keep sort of the engine going. And then we quickly pivot into sort of what we refer to as a growth stage, or what is referred to in the ebook as a growth stage, which is once that model has been proven and there is some kind of consistency in delivery, it's trying to move to that next level, which is that repeat business, that recurring revenue model. So and this is where we shift away from ordinarily cash into things like our unit economics, so lifetime value of the customer acquisition cost, those kind of elements. And again, and in addition to having those metrics, it's also how organizations can prepare for this scale, so how they can effectively start to get in some background processes that are consistent, so that when they grow and the volumes go up 10x, they don't necessarily have to grow their team 10x. So it's kind of getting those elements, and then it goes right through to the later stage models. So once they've got the recurring model working, so they've got the revenue model, they've got that repeat business, that second, third, fourth time customers coming back, and then we start to talk about things like profitability, and there are a few metrics that are related to that, pretty much right up until what we refer to as exit, which is really whether it's IPO or acquisition, kind of that end goal. And there again, there are a few metrics that are relevant to that. Focus more on net profit, but also some metrics around penetration of market that ensures that again, at various different, or at every stage rather, there is some kind of way to measure or prove that we've hit that particular stage. And I think the key thing around the various different stages, because again, customers we speak to are usually somewhere within there, and it's a bit of a spectrum. But this is really ultimately about understanding the metrics that you can use to measure the health of your business, but then also being aware that it's not just about the business, it's about what it looks to potential investors. So there are a few nuggets hopefully in there to highlight some of the key ways in which investors look at the business from the outside looking in, and then why that should matter and why it's important to track them as well.
Amazing. And the second I guess kind of step as it were is or point is around the tech stack, and with successful SaaS finance leaders to help them be successful. So what is that tech stack?
So again, here the rationale is really more around just getting the right systems in place that are going to provide sufficient detail and insight into making the right decisions. And again, it's in line with this idea of trying to move away from being your sort of typical number cruncher into actually someone that's driving strategic growth. So it's what is the environment you have to surround yourself around from a tech perspective that supports that. And again, it will change depending on the stage or maturity of the business, whether that's early stage, growth stage, right through to exit. But really, there are a few basics in there. So getting the accounting basics right. And that really talks into not just having the right finance processes, but also ensuring that the systems that you're working with are modern, are cloud, are scalable, and most importantly, are open. So you can almost assume that as the organization grows, there are going to be some silos that exist between teams if there aren't systems that can speak to each other. So just at that point, initially, it's just about making sure the system that you have is capable to scale by being able to open integrate either through API or through any other interface. Then once the basics are in from accounting perspective, then we start to see some of the deeper dive into some of the sort of more subscription or tech or software based elements. So managing things like revenue recognition, so ensuring that there's a right environment for things like changes in revenue recognition, compliances around them, so things like IFRS 15 on that basis. Once the accounting matrix is in, then it's the thirst for data. So dashboards are sort of heavily focused. The idea of being able to provide pretty much all the information in there, it should be provided in real time. It should allow you to not just track and monitor the health, but also be able to look at information different ways. Is it cash? Is it revenue? Is it billing? Is it upsells and downsells? Is it renewals? Is it the customer? All of those sort of touch points need to be picked up. And then I suppose as we move down that stage towards the aspirational element, then we start to talk about subscription billing. So it highlights this idea of shifting from the idea of orders into actually a more robust billing method, and then within that introducing things like pricing tiers, or introducing different types of billing models to try and not just sort of get more out of that customer and grow the account, but also sort of create a customer experience in terms of how you interact with them from a finance perspective, but then to try and drive some stickiness and some retention on that basis as well. So again, as I mentioned, it goes into a little more detail into the metrics themselves, but it's really about sort of those core elements of accounting, rev rec, dashboards and data, and then kind of moving to that billing model.
And the third key point is around sort of looking ahead, right, in terms of the role that finance leaders can play in the growth strategy. So what is that role that they play?
Yeah, again, this is, I would say, probably the main theme, which is moving to that more strategic role. So stepping away from, being operationally tied to the checks and balances, the debits and credits, the reconciliations, and moving towards a way that they can add more value to the business and really become the finance, or at least the CFO rather, to become a business partner to CEO, so it can be as forward-looking as the CEO on that basis. And they're kind of two ways in which, and I'm massively generalizing here, there's a little more detail in there, but there are two kind of key ways in which that's driven. It's A, through planning. And by planning, that could be anything from looking at potential forecast positions right through to actually making decisions about hiring and funding rounds, and when to go in for funding and how to use that. And then there's the second element, which is to some degree an element of utilization. So once you've got that funding round, how do you actually utilize those resources? And then most importantly, and as the kind of big theme within this ebook, is what are the metrics that allow you to track that's happening? So depending on the type of business you're dealing with, if it's growth stage, you're probably going to be looking more around things like what's the recurring revenue if I go here versus here. Whereas if we're dealing in a slightly more mature business towards the later stages, it's things like looking at those unit economics and looking at things like customer lifetime value against acquisition cost, and just having a slightly more long-term profitability view. Again, massively sweeping generalization, but yeah, and there's a lot more detail in there. But yeah, it really sort of touches on how to make that shift to be that value add.
It follows on into, I guess, the next point, becoming a value add finance team. So tell us more about that and what that means.
Yeah, so again, shifting from that whole number crunching element to being a bit more of a visionary, a bit more that's sort of navigating growth, trying to balance those resources, trying to scale, but effectively and seamlessly, because the tap or the lights are always on in terms of revenues always coming in. There isn't really a downtime within the growth to do so. So it's making sure the house is in order before going to market aggressively. So an interesting study that it references from some of the research that Sage delivered in 2019 on our CFO 3.0 forecast, which is around this concept of shifting the mindset of the CFO. It found that 51%, over half of the CFOs surveyed, would describe trying to find new ways to innovate the business and trying to find new ways to be more strategic in their role was the most challenging part of their role. So it shows there is a shift or a mindset from the days of CFOs being kept awake by month-end close, or CFOs being kept awake by reconciliations. It's very much the things that's keeping them awake is how they're going to enact their presence on the business. And another sort of element within that, without diving too much into it, 70% of CFOs would say they make these decisions on either judgment or gut feel. So very little sort of proportion of these decisions are being made based on data and real-time data, and you unsurprising, that's usually because of access to that information and trust in the information that it provides. So there's some of the sort of key elements. I would say within that value add, there are kind of two key themes that it touches on. There's a theme of building the right team, so things attracting talent, ensuring the right setup, and then also this idea of just delegating tasks to a system. Even within the finance team, it's not necessarily delegating it to another individual to handle it, because again, that the finance function needs to be a value add. So it's ensuring that where you would otherwise have spent time reconciling or spent time journaling or spent time tying or stitching systems together, just by having a framework where the systems are integrated or the elements within each system are automated, kind of just gives everyone back some time which they can work towards that sort of value add mission. So it touches on that being not just a CFO problem, but actually it's a finance problem to try and innovate and to try and drive more value to the business.
The fifth and final point is around impressing your investors, right? And 5 growth critical metrics that you need to know. So what are they? I don't know if we're going to share like all 5, but let's dive a little bit into that.
Yeah, sure. So the book references metrics all the way through. So it's worth noting within every single one of these steps, there is a metric or matrices that actually drive that. But in theory, the critical ones, and I think this is looking towards maybe growth stage and beyond, the critical ones that investors look for and that drive things like valuation and true health of external health of business. So it touches on, and they won't be too dissimilar, but it goes into a bit more detail into why they're important. So things like recurring revenues, the monthly recurring revenue, the growth rate on that. So how is that trending over time? How does that look? And there are a few stats in there from research, external research. So key banks research on across all their sort of SaaS organizations found some pretty interesting insights around where those average growth rates are. It talks about things like customer acquisition costs, but to try and make it more general, it provides a little bit more detail into kind of what some of those median rates are and what the payback in months is, to try and simplify and at least unify that feeling. So there's a lot more industry insight into that. And then, so they're typically your sort of startup growth based metrics, and then for the sort of exit stage or more mature companies, it's more of the standard finance metrics we're accustomed to. So things like EBITDA and understanding why it's net profit is more important than the gross, and growth when trying to shift into new markets, new regions, all of those elements as well. So I hope I've not gone into too much detail there, but hopefully that's given a little bit of a flavor into some of the elements within that.
Yeah, no, definitely has. So really excited about this. So scaling up, 5 key things SaaS finance leaders need to know is out now. We will post the URL for you where you can sort of download it on the blog that accompanies this podcast. Additionally, if you're watching on YouTube, you'll be able to see how you can download that as well. So exciting stuff. Great that SaaStock's partnering with Sage Intacct on this and providing a really valuable resource for those SaaS finance leaders that are looking to scale up. So thanks so much, Marvin, for joining me today and going into that and sharing a little bit about what people can expect from this ebook.
Awesome. My pleasure. Anytime.